Welcome to another episode of #Askalobbyist. Today I have with me Joost Mulder. He has quite a rich background here in Brussels, and I think it's best if I let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks Patrick for having me today at Askalobbyist. My name is Joost Mulder. I've spent quite a few years in European Parliament. I've worked in NGOs and in business consultancy, lobbying for the industry, lobbying for NGOs, for a big group called Finance Watch, and that is what I still do today in my own firm.
Great. And so, because your recent experiences in NGOs, we did get an interesting question from Simone Casadei, actually, via Twitter. Is it just me, Simone, or do people mostly relate lobbying with corporate and not so much with NGOs? We've discussed in previous episodes that lobbying has a very corporate image, like lobbyists are evil, there's tons of money involved.
Money, 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 must be funny in the rich man's world.
Is that the case?
I think there's two dimensions to that question, actually. So one is that there's a distinction that some people make between what you could call lobbying and advocacy. And this is particularly important in countries like the United States, where lobbying is a strictly regulated activity. And if, as an NGO, you put a funding request in to a large donor, and you mention the word lobby, it will go straight into the bin. And the debate has sort of been imported in Europe. Because of tax regulations, charities that fund NGO campaigns or can only finance lobbying to a certain extent. So if you're putting in a funding application, what you absolutely want to avoid is to mention the word lobbying.
What definition of lobbying do they have?
It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm.
That's why people typically resort to the word advocacy as an alternative. To me, advocacy is a much broader process where you try to build change in society bottom up through campaigning. And lobbying is only a very distinctive part of that process, where near the end you go and have face time with politicians.
So we have a clear definition of what lobbying means. In the US at least, do we have it in Europe?
I don't think so.
There's
of course the lobby register.
Yes.
And the lobby register is very stricter and stricter in its interpretation of what is considered to be lobbying and what is the time spent you have to declare. But I think there's still activities such as monitoring what is happening, networking meetings. It just came out of a breakfast meeting with another lobbyist, shaving in the morning so you look decent when you go and see a politician.
Okay.
Is that all part of lobbying?
Well, actually, there's two interesting things about what you just said. One is that you called it the lobby register, and I think it's called the transparency register, so we have something there. And the second thing is, indeed, what is lobbying? What part of your activities is lobbying?
Yeah.
Myself, everybody knows that by now, I'm in favor of just saying I'm a lobbyist, because that's what I do, I feel. But for me, most activities that contribute to the goal I'm trying to achieve for my clients, I see that as part of lobbying. Shaving, maybe not, because I would have shaved anyway.
Okay.
But a meeting in the parliament with somebody, another stakeholder, an MEP, I certainly see that as lobbying. Even if it's not directly on a specific case, at least it's leading up to something in the near future. So for me, it's a very wide definition, but I can imagine that, like in the US, there's a very narrow one. So it's very personal, I believe.
I think in consulting, you could say everything that you could realistically build to a client, or when you work as a lobbyist in a firm, anything that you would do work during working hours is probably, to a large extent, lobbying. It's
Right.
probably part of your job of understanding what's going on and influencing policy.
So to go back to the original question,
Here's Johnny.
there's apparently a difference between lobbying for big tech or corporations in general and NGOs on the other side. He also grouped schools and trade unions, for instance.
Well, I mean, one difference you see in general, and this is really generalizing, so it won't apply to all NGOs and say trade associations or business lobbyists, is that the organizations are structured in a different way. So in a business lobby, you will typically find functional experts, so people who do the research, who do the communications, who do the lobbying. Whereas in NGOs, people tend to be more vertically organized. So they work on a file. They work, for instance, on a certain aspect of climate. They work on a certain aspect of mobility. And they do everything on that file, from sort of research to condensing the information into
Right.
policymaker briefings, and then doing the actual lobbying work, which might only be, in their perception, 10 or 20% of their time. And so their job title typically also is something like campaigner, rather than lobbyist or head of public affairs or director of advocacy.
Well, I wonder, where do we stop campaigning and start lobbying?
Well, if you, for instance, look again at the US definition of lobbying, so what you see there is that certain NGOs that are benefiting from tax-deductible contributions, they cannot do actual lobbying, but they can do a lot of grassroots campaigning. Apparently, grassroots campaigning, creating momentum in society for your kind of change, is not considered lobbying. For me, it's an indirect form of lobbying. You are using the citizens, just like you are using the media, social media,
And he used me. He used us.
to influence politicians. One of the lobby tools that were very popular 5 or 10 years ago is just to make sure that your position would be in a letter to the editor in the Financial Times on the morning of an essential vote, because all politicians would read the Financial Times,
Right.
and then you would influence their voting. Is that lobbying? Or is it indirect influencing of politicians?
Means the same thing to me.
Exactly. For instance, in France, you see a very strong definition issue between plaidoyer and le lobbying.
Phrase 1. The French language is very sensual. La langue française est sensuelle.
And you can read this on the French Wikipedia if you want. It's very clearly explained that lobbying is for private interests and plaidoyer, advocacy, is for general interests. Now, in my definition of advocacy and lobbying, lobbying is about advancing your interests of a subgroup above the general interest.
If I ask you, what could business lobbyists and NGO lobbyists, what can they learn from each other?
One of the problems with NGOs, and it has to do with their internal structure and their funding and the way they program what they work on, is that they're typically only active in a small part of the policy cycle. So as people in Brussels know, the EU policy cycle ranges from anywhere between, say, 8 to 15 years. In 15 years, a certain piece of legislation will come back and will be revised and will make its way through the institutions, be negotiated, etc. Business lobbyists, and certainly trade associations who've been here for decades, they monitor, they track all of this stuff throughout the cycle. And they will be ready a few years ahead of the Commission coming forward with a new proposal in that area. They will be ready, they will have lobbied the right desk officers, and they will make sure that whatever comes out of the Commission is already quite suited to their needs.
Right.
So that they have to do less in the Parliament and in the Member States afterwards.
Agreed.
What NGOs tend to do is focus on 2 or 3 years of the policy cycle where they can maximize their influence. And that's when they're active. That's when they're active at campaigning, with parliamentary amendments typically, and where they try to move things around. However, if you look at the point in a policy cycle that NGOs are typically active on, it's not the best part in terms of influence. It tends to be the part where the debate is visible in the public, where it is politicized, which means when the Commission proposal is already out and it's in the Parliament. But the room for maneuver, the margin for maneuver that you have when something is in the Parliament is of course reduced compared to ahead of the Commission proposal.
Sure.
You could say that you could maybe still change 10% of the proposal, whereas 90% has already been dictated by the Commission.
So when I hear you say that, for me it sounds like trade associations are better organized than NGOs because they have a longer term view. They also they have a structural way of lobbying where they have these relationships with the desk officers. They're probably also part of some expert groups being invited by the Commission to give their input ahead of time, etc. Maybe you touched upon earlier that people in NGOs are generally more campaigning types.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons is the way that NGOs work. I mean, you pick up salient issues in society and you work on them. It's also how the funding works. You get money from a funder when an issue is at its tipping point, and that acting now is going to make a material difference. That visibility typically only comes when a debate is in the public sphere. There's also a lot of things they can learn from NGOs. NGOs, for instance, are much better at indeed citizens advocacy, getting citizens activated.
Right. You made a really excellent comment about getting people to fund your activities once it is perceived to be at a tipping point, once you can convince the public that it's now or never. That's one of my pet peeves in this entire business. Getting people to realize that you need to act way before something gets to that tipping point, when it's too late.
People in the NGO world, in civil society know this, but they are bound as well by the means that they have. And don't forget, there's also a few examples of civil society campaigns that have led to generational change. But if you look at the policy process and the influencing in Brussels, it does tend to be focalized on what is sexy and visible.
Looking for some hot stuff, baby, this evening.
This discussed the difficulty of getting people, clients, NGOs,
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
to realize that they should get in early.
One way to look at it would be to sort of distinguish between external lobbying and advocacy. So convincing policymakers here in Brussels and elsewhere that the legislation needs to change in your direction. An important part is actually internal lobbying. Convincing your boss, your clients, your organization that your cause is important, is going to be sexy in 2 or 3 years from now.
Looking for some hot stuff, baby, this evening.
And that you need to start campaigning, you need to start building momentum so that when the ship passes by, the train comes along, you actually are able to jump on it
Right.
and have a good campaign and influence the outcome.
Yeah,
Internal lobbying.
internal lobbying.
Give me money, give me people, and I will change the law. That's the story, right?
Before we started, you said that you would actually like to close off with a question of your own.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
that's a
Yeah.
great idea,
Yeah.
and let's have it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was a parliamentary assistant more than a decade ago, and I remember sitting in meetings, and we had a lovely office on the 15th floor, so I had a great view over the trains and trucks passing around Rue de la Loi. I remember sitting in these meetings that were very boring, and I was just taking notes, just pretending to be listening, but I couldn't give about what the lobbyist was telling me. And I was wondering, has that changed? So maybe if you get someone from the parliament to come and talk about how they perceive lobbyists.
So what do they think of lobbyists? Are they useful?
Are they the good ones, the good skills?
Uh-huh.
Are there still people, maybe it's less on the phone, but I remember one guy who used to work for a very big consultancy would call me 50 times a week to ask silly questions about when is the vote taking place.
Oh, God.
I hated that guy.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Joost, and that will be the next question. Definitely, we'll do it.
Okay, thanks
Thank
Patrick
you.
for having me. Yeah, take care.
Don't